Welcome back. We have Darlene here, the continuation from our first conversation. Real quickly, Darlene was at DTCC, remind you from the first interview. And Darlene, which DTCC's, what's the transaction amount again?
It's $2.5 quadrillion worth of transactions a year of
That's just
trade.
phenomenal, just crazy. So in the previous video, we talked a good bit in the interview about AI, and this was supposed to be AI low code. We did speak some on low code, but we really ended up in AI, and these things come together. But one of the conversations that you and I've had, this goes all the way back to some things at DTCC, some of the things that were going on there, was, and we've seen in the news, there's a company or two, I think you know who they are, who, and now, because you were the one who first pointed it to me,
Yeah.
that they're replacing Salesforce.com and some other popular packages they have, all building out custom workflows with low code and AI. And, we'll see. The jury's
Yeah.
out on that a little bit, but certainly that's coming our way. I do believe that is, as these products mature, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily, I believe, not going to completely get rid of your CRM if that's something you do, because you've got to collect data from the field, for example. But there's a lot of cases where people buy particular apps for a set of workflows and don't even use much of the other
Yes.
functionality. So can you tell me a little bit about um, some of what you've seen around this and some of the thinking? And really, I think you were telling me a conversation with one of your team members at DTCC. So maybe we could start there.
Yeah, so the example you're hearing is Klarna, right? They're probably going to go public next year. They are notoriously known for now pulling out Salesforce, and I believe it was Workday. But ServiceNow, I've heard rumors of that also is one that, these are very expensive tools. You pay by the license. If you look at history, someone the other day was just mentioning, like, we've really overdone the SaaS tools. I mean, I've got a subscription to everything, right? I have no idea how many subscriptions I have, how many passwords I put in. And a lot of these organizations have bought these SaaS tools, right? These platforms to do a specific job, but they use maybe like 10% of it, right? Or they're paying for people who use it just to search for data, right? Um, and so there's been a lot of rumors with all these agentic AIs, the ability that you could connect one AI. Let's say I'm working on prospecting and I want to search potential customers that would be ideal for me, right? I could get a list from a chatbot, right? I could then say, okay, can you put this into my customer database as prospects and rank them for me? And so then it'll connect to another agent AI that will kind of rank them and put them and say, okay, now can you put together like a calendar of, or start telling me who I should call first and what should be my pitch, and it's going to go out there and look at information. That's what people are talking about, right? You can't do that with Salesforce without having a Salesforce person who kind of clunkily puts it all together on their interface, right? The thought that you need tools to do workflow for you and store your data is a thing of the past, right? So yes, will people be pulling out Salesforce? I have no idea. Are there people who are saying, well, you know what, I've got 2,000 users on Salesforce, 80% of them are just using it for searching data. Okay, well, why do I need Salesforce for that? My customer data should be somewhere other than Salesforce, because what happens if Salesforce goes down? You're in trouble. So I would assume you have some form of a customer data place, right? Where could you just put a chatbot on top of it and people can just ask the question they want? Now, granted, you want to make sure that the results that come back are not generative AI generated, right? You don't want hallucination. So you want to make sure it's connected to the right, let's say, search API or the right model for anything predicting. But it should, your agent should be able to figure out where it needs to go to pull out the right information, and then it uses generative AI to give you the response. Think about it. If 80% of your people are just using Salesforce and you're paying for those licenses just to search data, well, take those out. There's another way to do it, right? And then you start thinking through, well, what other aspects do I use? What other aspects don't I use? And think through, do you Do you need a SaaS tool for it, or is there another way to handle it? So it's an interesting argument. I have it a lot with people that people will never take out Salesforce, but I've put it in 3 times. It is probably one of the more expensive tools that I hear about. Same thing with ServiceNow. It's very much very similar to Salesforce. So yeah, there are some companies that are actually digging in and trying to figure it out. Like, is it? And with low code, you know, it used to be you bought these tools because you didn't want to be the expert in, let's say, a CRM or a CDP, right? It was just too expensive to build a platform that you weren't going to maintain and grow, and you didn't want to be the expert. But if you look at it now, building these tools is really much simpler, and your teams are the expert at what they do, more so than what Salesforce will give you, because Salesforce will give you the generic cross experts. You will say, okay, well, we want to store it this way. You just have to be very good about the data model, right? How do you store that data? It's got to be flexible. But yeah, we'll see. I've had a lot of conversations with people about the future of platforms in organizations, even the IT department itself, right? What does it look like?
So, Darlene, can you give me kind of the technical tools that would be involved in building your own workflow? If you were going to use low code, or what that process would be. I mean, just at a high level, how that would, its inception through its deployment, and what kind of things would you be utilizing, especially if you were trying to stay away from big licenses?
Yeah, so you're going to want to be strategic, right? So if you look at what you're going to need, and Gartner has a really interesting like hamburger diagram that they show about like the future of AI. AI is a model, right? That's really what it is. So you're going to need a place to store your models. And strategically, what do you use as a cloud provider? Google, Microsoft, Azure, or AWS, right? Like, who do you use as your cloud provider? They probably have a place where models can store, whether you create them or you can take open source ones and put them in. You know, I'm a heavy believer that small specialized models are the wave of the future, and that you're going to use a large language model for just the generic use cases. So you want kind of that model hosting, not like a SageMaker where you're building yours, but like, let's say a Bedrock for AWS, right? Or let's say you use Snowflake for your data democratization, right? Where can you put models? And then what do you need? What are the applications on top of it that need to tap into it, right? And so rather than me going out and buying another SaaS tool that will look at like RFP flows, and you're gonna, like, for every task I do, am I gonna buy another AI agent, or am I going to just say, hey, can I orchestrate all these models to be together, and I put on top of it, the applications myself, right? For bigger firms, that's probably how you're looking at it, because you're going to change your models, right? You're going to rotate which one's best for whatever you're doing. And it may not be a model that you're using. You may not be predicting anything. You may want just the exact answer, right? Then it's like, okay, well, where do you store your APIs? How about your queries that people can tap into? So you're going to have a very more componentized, if that's a word, of your architecture. So that it's like, I can tap into a model, I can tap into an API, and my data is kind of the foundation, and what can you tap into? But yeah, it's not buying a bunch of agents, in my mind, to do every task, because you're just going to have far too many agents. It may start out that way, right? But over time, I think the concept of an agent connecting to another agent to fulfill a task is going to sit within let's say, your cloud provider environment, right?
So Darlene, when I think about this, you know, from let's call it rule of thumb, just in general, that when I look at a big part of, you know, Dutzer East, we're specialized in customer data, but we also own the API factory, which is where our starting point with you was. You know, we're doing modern architecture, event-driven architecture, what have you. And a lot of our work is around Salesforce, around ServiceNow. There is a lot of integrations that we're doing. And it strikes me from a rule of thumb that level of effort is needed whether I custom build or do Salesforce. It's not like you're putting Salesforce in and everything's hunky-dory. I mean, I've still got to get everything, all the other data sources, all the other transactional systems, all that data orchestrated and everything in sync, and make sure that that API architecture is flexible, secure, all of that. A lot of work. And so when I started thinking about, well, let's build a custom workflow with low code, that cost is there no matter what we do.
Yep.
So so my rule of thumb, or that feeling that there is money to be saved, is based on that fact that work has to be done, but not all that other expense needs to be added in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, think about it. Like, one of the biggest fears organizations have is vendor lock-in, right? So when you buy a SaaS tool, you're vendor locked in. These low-code tools now, I'm not talking about Pega, right? Because that would be vendor lock-in. But like, there are tools out there where it's like, yeah, you're not locked into the vendor. It's just creating code for you, right? That you can deploy on any cloud platform that you have, right? So if you're already going to have to APIs and move data around, right? Whether it was Salesforce or whether you do it yourself, right? I would say where companies need to focus on, where do you have data that's sitting with a vendor that ultimately is going to be sitting in-house anyway, right? Start with those, because do you really need to hand that vendor? If they're not doing anything proprietary with that data, right? Let's say it's like Salesforce, a lot of it's workflow and data storage, right? If there are aspects where, like, yeah, they've got specific models that do next best action. Well, what is going to happen to Salesforce is they're probably going to have a bunch of models that they give to people to use, right? Or not give, but you could purchase, right? But I look at it going, yeah, if the tool itself just does data collection, data storage, and workflow management, there's an opportunity for you to rethink that to your own workflow that you can easily adapt to it, right? At a lower cost.
I'm kind of laughing a little bit because this is an uncomfortable conversation, because I've got a good partnership with Salesforce. I spend a lot of time integrating their things, and so it's but it is what it is, and this is a trend, and it's something that people need to seriously be looking at.
Yeah.
Additionally, I imagine that Salesforce is aware of this risk, and I'm not really quite sure of how they're responding to it. But
Well, they're doing a big push. Last week, it was either last week or the week before, they put out that they're trying to get 1,000 salespeople to sell their agentic AI model. Now, what might happen with Salesforce is, okay, the workflow and the data storage, it becomes you use their agentic model so that you're not building it yourself, right? Can it sit on your own data? What does that pricing model look like? But they were quick to move on, knowing that what I said is probably not news to them, and they already are aware of it, right? The fact that I'm saying, yeah, it's really, most of these SaaS tools are really there for workflow and data storage. Like, okay, they know things. First of all, they know workflows. The concept of workflows, putting rules in a system, is probably going to be gone in the next 10 years, right? That I'm no longer going to predefine rules in a system, right? So they're already moving to figure out how to adopt what they're doing, and they're really going down the agentic AI path, right? It'll be interesting. I look at, like, the industry. I'm writing up something now where, this agent orchestration. Does Darlene have a personal agent where I'm like, hey, book my travel? Well, agents are going to have to speak to each other. Like, yeah, book your travel. I'll go to Expedia. I'll go to Delta. I'll go to hotel.com. But, like, firms have got to open up their data to be able to have agents, or they'll be an industry agent, right? Like, what is the future agent look like? What do these agents look like? And I think nobody knows the answer, but I think Salesforce is one of the few who's quickly trying to figure it out, because they know that the writing's on the wall, that how we do our business is how we operate, fundamentally going to change.
Well, one of the misconceptions around Salesforce or like products, I don't, whoever we're talking about, Microsoft has a version, what have you, is we start getting into larger companies that are concerned about personalization and marketing. And let's face it, these days it seems like 80% of the data things I'm dealing with are that. Yeah. The other 20% are operational efficiency kind of issues for logistics, right? Yeah. So when you think about that, it's a misconception to think that all your customer 360 view is in your CRM, where CRM is gathering info on transactions. In general, it's a source for a customer data platform of some sort, whether it's called a customer data platform or not. There is some model somewhere that has the enriched data that includes coming from CRM, comes from third party, what have you. So those things in of themselves suggest workflow. To me, right? So we're going to get into this in a future conversation, I believe. Let's jump back. Are there any misconceptions around low code right now? I mean, as far as where it is today and where it's heading, or is this idea that we're going to completely replace developers? And then I would also ask, to me, it strikes me that this is going to up the importance of your architects.
Yes.
Can you
and
talk
your standards and your governance, right? So, I mean, we've been shifting development forward to the business for several years, right? Oracle, Microsoft Power Apps, great one. I did an experiment. One of the misconceptions is like citizen development. It's always considered a taboo word, but there's some benefits to being able to do certain things. So let's say I wanted an innovation portfolio management tool. I didn't want to use Excel, which is what we were using because it crashed all the time. And so I wanted to prove that some level of citizen development is possible within an organization efficiently, securely, and safely, right? So I had my portfolio manager, who is not technical by any means, work with the Microsoft Azure team to build me an innovation portfolio management tool with a dashboard out of Power BI. We were showcasing it around all the PMOs. She did it with an intern twice a week, right? She did it in a number of weeks. We've been moving that way. But what it's going to do is we had to be in line with the architects. They were there looking at what we were doing. They made sure that when it came to the single sign-on, that it was single sign-on. It had its security, right? They could then monitor, because there's this concept of yuccas, right? You've heard of a yucca, which are all in financial world, or all these spreadsheets that run financial calculations for reporting, but they're spreadsheets. They're coded in spreadsheets. You can't monitor them. You can't track them. You have to do it manually. You have to have them attest to them every year. Well, at least in these things like Power Apps, right? Which I still feel is clunky. Microsoft can probably hate me for that too, but it's a clunky low code tool. But they can be monitored, right? So what I build can be monitored. Updates can be tracked. So if something goes wrong with a yucca, I can't, right? Because someone on their desktop is creating some, crazy algorithm in Excel that calculates what I'm reporting on financially into the market, right? So I look at low code, it will enforce standards because IT will have visibility into it better. But there's still some beliefs that it's still, some low code's still clunky. You still need a developer to help you out. It just, they can do things much faster, quicker, because they're not having to figure, they can kind of just drop and drag. But where there are challenges, they have to go in from behind the scenes and fix the code, right? I don't see I don't see developers going away. I see them shifting forward. Like what I call digital factory. The developers just moved from central IT to the middle North America team, and where now I could probably give them someone who's just doing it on their own for each of their own teams, and that's a resource that they could afford, right? Versus before they would have to have an entire tech, the whole gamut of technology. So low code, it's not there perfectly for the non-tech person. You still need a technical person, but it's getting there, right?
By the way, you mentioned digital factory. I'm going to need to invite you back with Paul one day, because Paul and that digital factory team over there, that's really, really fascinating, the directions they're heading in. Speaking of that too, we had talked a little bit about the cost of AI in the previous session. I know these guys down in Miami, for example, Carlos Joffrey, guys came out of Norwegian Cruise Lines. I think their company's called Adapt AI, and it amazes me, bespoke large language models, but at an extremely affordable price.
Yeah.
So the cost of delivering these things, these guys are rising up, is also out there. And when Carlos showed me what he was doing, and you looked under the covers, it's every bit as safe as the big guys at a fraction of the cost. So there's just a lot of capability to deliver out there right now.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about this collaboration. You're talking about somewhat democratizing with a citizen developer,
Yep.
and we're talking about governance coming out of an architecture team,
Yep.
developers that have to understand where this world's heading. How is this collaboration working? I mean, I'm going to deal with, let's say, Susan over here, who's in charge of this particular function. Susan has some capability to tell me what she wants, can use a prompt perhaps. Mm-hmm. How is that going to work? How do you see that working, that kind of collaboration between IT and the users?
So I see it being very much certain things. IT will have visibility into what's being done, right? By the nature of how they establish the low-code tool. They'll know what applications are going up there. They'll know whether there's like challenges or problems. They'll be able to track like builds, right? In what's happening now with spreadsheets and PowerPoints or like project plan, things like that they can't really track. So you'd have that. So I envision, there'll be certain things that the front office can do, right? They'll be given certain capabilities of like building pages. They'll be able to connect to APIs that already exist. You'll have standards like, let's say, I know, for example, at Reckitt, we had a standard template for registration of a person, an account, right? And they could add their fields where they want because the database was, let's say, a name value pairs, right? It wasn't relational, so there wasn't like lock-in into the data model. It was very open. So they could pick and choose whatever, field they wanted to capture, and the API could handle it, right? They just chose an API. So I feel like they'll have it, in my mind, there'll be someone technical on the side of the business, because now you don't need the full stack of developers there. You can have someone who can speak the language, and this person probably is technical as much as they are business, right? You're going to need someone who's overseeing this that really does understand and sit between the front and the back. And that really, the issues with IT, bug tracking, governance, security, all those standards just sit with IT. But that more or less, I'm seeing brands have a technical person on their team. Similar, like, I hate to bring up Salesforce again, but like same thing, like usually the Salesforce team sits with the marketing team more so than they do with IT. I see the same thing, right? It's just now you're talking full stack development, right? I want to build a mobile app. I don't have to go to IT to get that or hire Accenture to do it. I can use that same resource in the business to build it. It's being deployed on a standard infrastructure, which is going through security checks as it's being deployed. And there's probably someone on IT reviewing different things of code, right? Like even the testing is relatively automated. I mean, we're already looking at synthetic data being able to handle more use cases on testing. There's all sorts of creating of test cases with AI that can be done. So like, so much of it is just turning into anybody could really do it. So I look at it going, we've already been moving, right? This is just saying now I could probably pretty much take almost anything I want to do and have it built in the front, and it still can be secured and governed and maintained by an IT department.
So one thing I'm thinking about what you're saying, and so I don't want to turn this into an API session, but there is some assumptions here that there is a framework, an API framework in place. And if somebody's wanting something that requires, let's say, a new exposed API, and now you're talking about exposing it out to the public, then I see IT having to come into that. And then related to that, when I look at, doing a lot of API design work as a company, and boy, the line is blurred between whether we're doing API work or doing data.
Data.
Right?
I look at it going, it's just how do I access that data? right?
And, and how do I keep its integrity?
Right?
How do I keep it governed?
Yep.
How do I deal with timing? How do I deal with not overwhelming the system overall? All of those things. And then I start talking about citizens development. No matter how much control I'm giving in them, I have to understand what might happen. I
Exactly.
have to understand how this could impact data, whether that's a performance issue or whether that's the potential to corrupt something.
Yep.
I think it's something where the timing, how
Yep.
you timed something could cause a problem. So I see that while I see great efficiencies from low code, I see the pressure on governance rising a lot and having
Yes.
to understand and having to think through, okay, what is, let's call it, it's a platform. What is
Platform.
my private platform
Yep.
for
And what are the
allowing this to
capabilities
happen?
I'm allowed? And then what does IT own? And in the case of Reckitt, they owned anything data. So I couldn't create a data model. I couldn't, it was like here's the customer data model, right? And everything. And it didn't disrupt anything I was doing. And then they created like APIs and the integration, right? I could tap into those however I wanted, right? Because the data is really what you're trying to protect. And when it all is said and done, all of the hacking in the world, it's the information that they're trying to get. Whether they're trying to get passwords to break into accounts, or just trying to say, hey, I want a bug bounty, so I'm going to take your 400 million records, right? So that's what IT becomes a data. And I think we've been very passive with data for many decades, that if you're not thinking through the data at the start of anything first, you're doing whatever you want to disservice. From here on out, every company should be thinking, what happens when I put a chatbot on this? Right?
So we're kind of coming up against 30 minutes here. I think invite you back for one more. I want to really talk about AI, low code in the MarTech space,
Yep.
which in our first session we talked about as probably the most rational place for people to start, and probably some of the best return as well on investing in that direction. And we touched a little bit on the problems with data and the problems that a lot of people have. And by the way, when we talk about that front office, one of the trends we've seen when we start talking about personalization and marketing is CMOs going out and buying products like Adobe's Experience
Yep.
platform. It's starting there with the segmentation, the personalization engines, but now finding themselves drifting into the customer data itself and intersecting with IT there. And conflict might be the wrong word, but it is
Yep.
certainly close to the right word
Yes.
between
Because
IT and,
shadow ITs,
yes, the shadow ITs.
the shadow IT
So
departments.
thanks a lot for today,
Thank
and I
you.
look forward to having one more session with you,
Me
Darlene.
too. Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you.
My cursor's all the way over here. There we go.